Legacy Precious Metals is the company that I trust to give you good and patient counsel for investing in your retirement. The Biden administration has caused a financial crisis, and they have no clue how to fix it. Oil prices have skyrocketed, and when oil prices go up, not only do your expenses go up, but the cost of transportation and shipping spikes, leading the prices of goods to rise. And we are already seeing record inflation. That's the last thing that we need. Our economy is in trouble, and you need to take steps to protect yourself. If all your money is tied up in stocks, bonds, and traditional markets, you may be vulnerable. So gold is one of the very best ways to protect your retirement. No matter what happens, you own your own gold. It's real, it's physical, and it's always been valuable since the dawn of time. Call Legacy Precious Metals today at 866-528-1903 or visit them online at legacypminvestments.com. That's legacypminvestments.com, where you can download the free investor's guide. You can also go to my Facebook page, Jenna Ellis. I am a public figure on Facebook, and I just posted yesterday a really great interview with the president of Legacy Precious Metals, who is discussing why you need to start your retirement account even if you're in your 20s or 30s. There is always a great time to protect your retirement and invest, just like you want to protect your health over the long term. So go to Legacy Precious Metals at legacypminvestments.com or call 866-528-1903.
As a constitutional law attorney, former senior legal advisor, and personal counsel to President Donald J. Trump, Jenna Ellis believes in the rule of law and the importance of integrity in our elections. And she's ready to tackle the big cultural and legal issues facing America. This is the Jenna Ellis Show. Here is your host, Jenna Ellis.
Okay, so joining me now is one of my very good friends who is an amazing, excellent lawyer, and I wanted to have on this show to talk about another really interesting and fascinating angle of the whole transgender sports issue. So Bill Bock, and thanks so much for joining me. And you actually headed up the litigation on some of the anti-doping for the United States government and for the Olympics. And so talk a little bit about your background and experience with some of the anti-doping.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jenna. It's good to be with you today. I have been involved representing athletes in Olympic sport for about the last 25, 30 years. The last 14 years, from 2007 to 2021, I was the general counsel for the United States Anti-Doping Agency, and they do all the drug testing for Olympic sport in the United States. So our job was to keep a level playing field, to ensure that sport was fair and just, and so my responsibilities included arbitrations over the issues of the use of performance-enhancing drugs like testosterone in sport, and investigations of breaches of the rules. And some of the cases that we handled were the Bay Area Laboratory Cooperative, the Balco case that involved Marion Jones and Tim Montgomery and others, the Lance Armstrong cycling investigation, where he was required to give up his 7 Tour de France titles. And so that's a little bit of my background in Olympic sport.
So this is fascinating because a lot of the I guess discussion and a lot of the conversation has been around this diversity and inclusion. And when we're talking about someone like, the UPenn swimmer who is a biological male, has now transitioned, says that he is a woman and is participating in women's sports, a lot of the conversation has been around the self-identification, the difference between sex and gender, what qualifies a woman. And what I'm seeing lacking in the conversation, other than obviously the biological difference between a male versus a female, is this kind of understanding of the chemical enhancement that biological males have over women and how that changes the nature of sports. And so when we're talking about supplements like testosterone, I mean, it's my understanding, like if a biological female at the Olympics were to take testosterone, that would actually be an illegal doping use, right? So how is this in any way comparable, and why aren't we having these types of broader conversations when we're contemplating transgender participation in sports?
It's a great question, Jenna. I think part of the answer sometimes is the loudest voice in the room wins. And sometimes while we talk about following the science, we don't tend to do that. And, maybe in this respect, lawyers can be part of the problem because there is a lot of litigiousness in sports. And sometimes I think sport governing bodies can suffer from a bit of a lack of courage. And the group that is really being left out here are the biologically female athletes. Female athletes, women athletes are being severely disadvantaged because we know on the anti-doping side of things that there's no more powerful performance enhancer than testosterone. And the level of testosterone produced by a biological male is many times that is produced in a female. And it's not a transient effect. Testosterone has a lifelong effect on the development of musculature and just overall strength that is not lost even when testosterone suppressant drugs are taken. And part of the approach in sport has been to allow transgender participation of biologically male athletes, but who have identified as female. They've been sometimes allowed to participate after taking testosterone suppression. That doesn't address the lifelong changes that come about to one's physique and performance enhancement that's gained simply from having grown up as a male.
So where are these cases right now when you're talking, I mean, there's been a lot of precedent, and you mentioned a couple of the cases. I think probably most of my listeners are at least familiar with Lance Armstrong. I mean, that was a really worldwide case of what happened there. But where is the bright line rule in terms of anti-doping right now, and how or if is the law changing on this particular issue related to transgender sports and things like testosterone?
Well, the sad thing about it is that we've drawn these categories of doping or transgender participation in sport, and we've drawn a line between them. And so while you couldn't take testosterone to get up to a level of almost 4 or 5 times the testosterone level of the average female in sport, you couldn't do that through taking testosterone, but you can do that through changing your gender identity. And
so it's a loophole, basically.
It is absolutely a legally defined loophole that really, I believe, threatens to destroy females and sport participation. Yeah.
So when you're looking at some of this legislation, like what Kristi Noem is putting forward, I was actually very disappointed that she vetoed the prior protection of women's sports. Is this being addressed in any of the legislation that you've seen across the country, this particular argument about anti-doping and testosterone?
Primarily, the legislation that's going forward on a state-by-state basis is affecting high school sports. And there's so far not been a comprehensive effort to address collegiate sport and sport at the Olympic level. There are rules in place. They aren't very effective at leveling the playing field, in my opinion. And we're actually seeing a retrogression in those rules. The IOC adopted a new framework for going forward, where they now wholly subscribe to the idea that gender is fluid and one can choose their gender, and have included preferences for allowing somebody to change their gender. and will make it legally very difficult to keep the playing field level. Uh, so, and what, I'm sorry.
So, so how do they get away with? And if I can ask you this question, how do they get away with in the rules the inequality that's there? That if you change your gender identity, then it's okay to use these performance-enhancing drugs. And if you go and abide by your biologically assigned, and I hate to, commandeer their language, but that's what they call as your biologically assigned gender, then females who still identify as females can't use the same levels of doping. How do they get around any sort of issue of equality there if that's really what everybody's concerned with?
They talk a lot about equality in the rules. They actually talk about a term of equity, which is really undefined, and they talk about fairness, but it doesn't work out that way because you simply can't turn back the biological clock, and once somebody has gone through puberty as a male, they're going to have lifelong physiological differences that make them a more capable, faster, stronger athlete generally than most female athletes. And so you're going to have athletes that all of a sudden, like the Penn swimmer, you're going to have them all of a sudden go from being a not an elite level athlete to becoming on the male side, where he competed for 3 years, to when he transferred to becoming a female. Now he or Leah Thomas, the trans female athlete, has set 10 records at Penn in one season and has won numerous meets. So that's going to continue to happen, and obviously that's very discouraging to girls. But what ought to happen is that we ought to have sports organizations that have the courage to confront this issue directly. But unfortunately, we haven't seen that. We've seen the NCAA adopt new rules, which are not really rules because they purport to defer to the sport national governing body in each sport, and they know that those national governing bodies don't have rules. And so what happened in the sport of swimming was just a week ago. On January 19th, the NCAA said that they adopted this new procedure and that swimming would be governed by the rules of USA Swimming. USA Swimming issued a press release the next day that basically said, we don't have any rules. We're waiting on the International Federation to develop the rules. And then we'll follow those rules when the International Federation develops them. So it's a classic game of pass the buck, and the group that is being hurt are female athletes. And the group that is advantaged are those that are the loudest in the room, screaming for their rights, but not as concerned about the rights of others.
Yeah, and so as we're looking at the difference between high school sports, college sports, and then of course on the Olympic or elite athlete level, is there a difference in the national versus international conversation among the lawyers? Is there a difference between maybe the NCAA, who is kind of going along with this woke partisanship that is unfortunately the America culture right now, versus the Olympic Committee, who of course has influence from all of the participants of the countries? And I was looking at the headlines the other day about this new non-binary figure skater that's going to be in the Olympics that are coming up in just a few weeks, and how the Olympic Twitter account is openly celebrating this, and a few of those other things. Is there a difference in the conversation in the international level? Is there hope there, or are you seeing other countries as well kind of bowing to this ridiculous identity sort of a definition?
Yeah, and the IOC has bought into the gender identity idea, the idea that one can choose their own gender, and that we should respect that. And so where that becomes problematic, obviously, is where it causes competitive inequity and inequality. And the categories of male and female athletes have worked quite well for a long period of time. And to abandon those categories now is going to have tremendous consequences for a lot of young women. And it's not that trans athletes shouldn't participate in sport. I know, Jenna, you participate in sport. All of us, regardless of our age, we enjoy athletics of one sort or another, and we should. And every human being should, and that includes trans athletes. But one's choice to redefine themselves should not eliminate the choices and the opportunities of a whole class of athletes, which is what's happening right now. There are people that are standing up, but unfortunately they don't tend to be in positions to make the decisions at them.
Which unfortunately always seems to be the case, right? The people who are actually willing to stand up don't necessarily have the power or the authority to do anything about it. But in terms of the litigation around this, I know some of our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom are representing some of the female athletes in the collegiate level that are challenging the transgender athletes' participation. Where do you see the law going? What should be the solution here to give the ability, and I think you're right, that every person, every human being should be able to participate in sports, but what is actually fair, what is actually equitable? Like you said, male and female categories have worked really well until we started finding all of these loopholes. So what should be the bright line standard? Where should the law go from here?
Yeah, well, certainly Alliance Defending Freedom has done tremendous work in this area, and I think that the good thing about our legal system is that we traditionally have recognized rights of groups to prevent discrimination, and to a degree, this is a very discriminatory situation towards women, because women are the ones that are being harmed here, and women are the group that have had traditionally fewer opportunities in sport. Title IX, a federal statute, was enacted to try to bring about more of a balance in sport. And just as we're getting close to seeing more balance, now this issue threatens women's sport once again. So I think Alliance Defending Freedom and many other, even what you're seeing are a lot of Olympic athletes and a lot of females, but also male Olympic athletes that are saying, this isn't right. And they understand what it's like to line up on the starting block next to somebody that they think might be doping. It has a chemical, structural advantage that they've gained unfairly, and so this issue is not that different. It may be that those that trans athletes did not intend to cheat, are not trying to cheat. At the same time, they have a structural advantage that disadvantages female athletes. Athletes understand that. I think you'll see a movement of athletes that are going to insist on fairness and equality.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that even Caitlyn Jenner, who is obviously was a male athlete under Bruce Jenner, and obviously won the gold medal, participated in the Olympics, has now come out as Caitlyn Jenner and is actually against trans athletes' participation in women's sports for those distinctive advantages, and is someone who both, I think, the media and the culture at large have recognized the sympathy of Caitlyn toward the transgender movement, obviously, and as a participant, but also to have someone like that come out and stand up against trans participation. And so some people have said or have floated the idea of maybe just having a trans participation category and a whole separate category. So you have male, female, and then trans. I don't particularly see that that's necessarily helpful. I mean, at what point then do people who maybe can't make it in their own category that they would otherwise have to participate in, then somehow they just get a new category because they say, hey, I'm going to identify as a certain way. And so somehow now they get a whole separate category that they have an advantage in actually winning and competing. But then other people would say, well, that then at least eliminates the unfair aspect toward biologically females still identifying as female categories. So do you think that there's any merit to that being a solution?
I think one of the issues in sport has been kind of a resources issue, and that's why women have faced problems in terms of having the same sort of opportunities as men. There are limited resources, so
and viewership
if you're
interest,
going,
frankly. I mean, there are some I wouldn't watch a women's football team. I just think that would be boring, and you see the differences between, WNBA versus the regular NBA. There's a viewership issue, and that's fair. People can choose what they want to watch too.
And part of that, and that is the case, and certainly, 80% of the funding in sport goes to men's sport, and 80% of the revenue is generated by men's sport, and that's part of the reason why. So trying to fund a third category is probably going to diminish opportunities more than it's going to increase opportunities. That doesn't mean that if somebody wants to start a trans athlete league, they shouldn't be free to do that. That would absolutely be fine. But trying to mandate that there be a third category, I think would adversely impact everyone.
So then, so with that, and I think that actually is a brilliant argument. I mean, it's not one that is just based on what should we do in terms of equality, but in terms of resource. And frankly, who's going to watch a trans league? I don't think that we'll have a lot of athlete participation. We're not even seeing that. It's somewhere, some statistics have shown that it's less than 3% of the population, and now suddenly we have to pretend that there's always trans inclusion and representation in literally everything we do, including entertainment and so forth. But it probably just wouldn't get and generate the kind of revenue that other sports leagues do, and particularly the men. But so what should the solution then be in terms of a bright line standard of how we can truly define fairness, how we can truly define, making sure that other people's rights to participate aren't diminished based on trans athletes' participation, like women, but actually have a bright line standard that's judicially cognizable and is actually a good bright line rule?
Yeah, well, the male and female categories, like I said, are the traditional categories that have been in use for decades. And that is really, at birth, the bright line standard is established, and I think that maintaining that standard makes eminent sense, good sense, and is the way forward. And if somebody decides that they want to use medical means to try to, in their terminology, transition their gender, then they can do that, but they still have to compete in the category in which they were born. I think that ultimately becomes the fairest approach. Now, the prior IOC approach was to regulate on the basis of testosterone levels. That is a kind of secondary approach that is, I think, more fair than kind of just opening it up with rules that allow each sport to determine without any sort of objective standards what the lines are going to be. And they had a scientific group that tried to establish a limits on testosterone levels. I think it was a project that a bit was doomed to failure because even the limits that they established had transgender athletes able to compete at 4 to 5 times the level of testosterone of the average female. So they trans athletes had an advantage under that system. Unfortunately, though, that system has been jettisoned for a more supposedly inclusive system, which has no bright lines and leaves it up to each sport, and will mean tremendous confusion within Olympic sport over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. And unpredictability, and also allegations probably of discrimination depending on which one is more quote unquote accommodating versus others. And so are there any cases beyond the ones that we've already discussed that, ADF is representing some athletes at the collegiate level? Are there any other cases that we should be aware of to follow in terms of this particular transgender athlete issue?
I think one of the interesting issues, obviously in Olympic sport, international sport, which is where I've spent most of my life, that's controlled by the International Olympic Committee. And they have kind of a monopoly, they and the international federations, over sport internationally. And so what they do is tremendously influential here, but around the world. And there is a legal body in Switzerland called the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And the IOC regulations that have been most recently proposed state that trans athletes should be able to have challenges to the rules that are put in place to ensure their participation. But they don't appear to give the same right to challenge the fairness of the rules to female athletes, to non-trans athletes that are disadvantaged by the rules. So I think what may end up happening is that there will be a challenge before the Court of Arbitration of Sport as to whether or not athletes that aren't trans don't want to change, they want to stay in their category, particularly female athletes. Can they challenge rules that are not fair to them that allow trans athlete participation? I think that'll be interesting to see. And if the Court of Arbitration for Sport were to say, no, you cannot challenge those rules, then it's going to lock female athletes into a disadvantaged position, not only on the playing field, but legally.
Yeah, and this is where, for all of the listeners, this is why our U.S. Constitution has built in a lot of these protections, like equal protection, and being able to say that, anyone should be able to petition the government, for example, for redress. But you don't see those same protections in every kind of legal body or forum that might be render an arbitration decision. And so some of these things, it would seem very offensive to our notions as Americans of fairness and justice and equity to even contemplate that females wouldn't be able to challenge the rules, but transgender athletes would, and that there is some sort of differentiation between those. But it's a good lesson of why our Constitution and why our rule of law and our American jurisprudential process is actually, I think, one of the best in the world, because other types of forums don't allow some of those same balances and some of those same balance of the equities. So that's going to be really interesting and fascinating. And so, Bill Bock, just in the last couple minutes that I have with you here, so how long do you think that if this kind of truly discrimination against women's sports is allowed to proceed, do you think that we're going to see women just fall out of the sport? How long are we going to see this kind of fever pitch before we reach a point that it's going to have to be contemplated in terms of fairness? When are we going to see more of a resolution of this issue?
The impact, I think, is already dramatic on female participation in sport. I had the opportunity to meet a young lady from Connecticut who is continuing in the sport of track and field, but she lost probably several potential state championships, finishing third behind two trans athletes competing in the female category in 2 consecutive years in the sprints. And she described how discouraging that was to her. And if she had seen this happening. Before she was a junior in high school, she confessed to me she might not be a collegiate runner today. She might have chosen something else to devote her time to. And I think that girls are making those choices now. They're looking for, where can we be treated fairly? And that's going to mean a loss of opportunities in a lot of different sports if this trend is permitted to continue. And unfortunately, it's not a situation where the legal system reacts very quickly and is able to make a change on the dime to prevent the deterioration of women's sports. I think, unfortunately, this trend that we're seeing, it could be a negative one for a long time. Again, unless there's some leadership. Some of the sport governing bodies are going to need to stand up and not pass the buck and not say nothing but that trans athletes get to participate. I mean, okay, that's
Yeah, not just buy into the cultural talking
right,
points, but actually look at fundamental fairness, look at this
right,
objectively, truthfully, and actually be willing to stand up for women and not think that that is somehow discriminatory. You're a bigot or any of these terms. I mean, it's just as false as some of these other notions of voter suppression and racism just because we want to have verification of identity at the polls. I mean, some of these things that are the cultural talking points and the punishment that people try to inflict on advocates for truth, especially in a legal forum, is really frustrating, I think, to people like you and I, Bill, who understand that we should be able to advocate for truth, but also for client causes and for things that are fundamentally fair without some of that rhetoric and the false drawbacks that are more culturally influential than, honestly, that they're not legally significant, nor should they be.
yeah. Sport emphasizes courage, and we see a lot of courage on the playing field, and athletes playing hurt, athletes taking on great challenges. We see very little courage in the front office. We see very little courage in the sport leadership. And it becomes the gold medal for sport, unfortunately, has become the gold. It's become money, and sport leaders shy away from anything that they think may cause adverse publicity. But women are worth standing up for, and when sport leaders, a sport leader finally recognizes that, I think they will ride a cultural tide of individuals that care about women's sports. They just need to stand up and be a leader. But right now, we're not seeing that. We're seeing, unfortunately, people that are kind of afraid of the cancel culture and not willing to talk about bright lines and fairness for women in sport.
Right. Well, it sounds just like government. It sounds just like Congress. And I don't know whether to be, kind of like, well, at least then Congress isn't as bad, or really discouraged that there are no leaders across the board to see that, politics is just as pervasive in sports as it is in government, as it is in the church, frankly. But this is a really fascinating issue, and thanks so much for joining me, Bill Bock. I think this has been a really good conversation to give people just a different perspective on more of an anti-doping and the fundamental fairness, not just the cultural issues and so-called identification of transgender athletes versus the true impact on women's sports. So as some of these cases continue to progress in the legislation, I hope you'll come back on and share your insights. Thanks so much.
Jenna, thanks for bringing the attention to this important issue. Thank you for the opportunity.
Before I go, I also want to talk about another great American who is the sponsor of this podcast, and that, of course, is my good friend Mike Lindell. He has been canceled out of so many box stores for simply standing up for his own political opinion. And disagree or not, or support him or not, It is a fundamental right of every American to be able to voice their opinion, and that absolutely includes politics. That absolutely includes issues that are central to our culture. That includes faith. Mike is such a very sincere Christian, and I am proud to consider him a friend, and he is, of course, a friend of this show. So right now, there is a special on mypillow.com. Click on the new radio listener specials. Get deep discounts on all MyPillow products, including a great towel set, which is a 6-piece set. It includes 2 bath, 2 hand towels, 2 washcloths, made in the USA, regularly $109.99, now just $39.99, but you have to use the promo code Jenna. That's Jenna. That tells Mike that you listen to this show, you're happy that he is a sponsor of this show, and you will get great discounts, but use the promo code Jenna, that's Jenna, either at mypillow.com or call 1-800-564-8475 and use the promo code Jenna.